Welcome to Church History with our guest, Snek and David. And we're back. We're doing part 2 of our conversation review of church history. I am Father Deacon Ananias. And again, we have our hosts, Snek and David, our resident apologists and theologians, to help us give a purview over what we've covered thus far. So what we talked about is the beginning of the church in part 1, 33 AD, Pentecost. And we talked about the structure of the early church, some of the documents like the Didache, the development of the assembling of the writings of the apostles, and also the process of the canonization, how the Orthodox view the canon of Scripture, and its finality being marked around 680 AD as far as a final authorized canon. We talked about the church's set a precedent, the church set a precedent for how to deal with disputes and various disagreements. The Council of Jerusalem, as mentioned in Acts, set the precedent, and as we see through the history of the church, various disputes and heresies would arise, of which that set the precedent. We had councils, and we talked a little bit about how councils work, specifically on the larger scale councils of an ecumenical council. We identified various heresies through the history of the church that had to be dealt with. We defined what a heresy is not simply just getting something theologically or intellectually in error, but is truly a disobedience and a sin of pride, and therefore excommunication is really a call to repentance and obedience back to the family of the church, and the incorporating back into the apostolic deposit of faith. We talked about early heresies being Gnosticism, Docetism. We talked about adoptionism, modalism or Sabellianism. We talked about Arianism, the famous heretic out of Alexandria that was one of the largest widespread and becomes the impetus for the first Ecumenical Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. And we talked about Apollinarianism and what that was, and that, again, this was answered in Alexandria in 362 AD and Chalcedon 451. So that kind of just gives a review of everything that we've discussed, a brief review on part 1. And so we're going to pick up where we left off, and we are going to delve into what is called the heresy of Nestorianism. We talked a little bit about that idea, and these heresies resurfacing over and over again in various new forms. But basically, Nestorianism was based on Nestorius, and it was the idea that the Logos indwelt the person of Jesus, making Christ a God-bearing man rather than God, the God-man Theanthropos, and accused of teaching two persons within Jesus Christ. So there's a separation. So that's kind of a brief overview of what Nestorianism is, and then we'll talk about the councils a little bit later. We'll touch briefly on Council of Chalcedon right now, but David, why don't you pick up there? Nestorianism. Who is Nestorius? What is the heresy?
Well, one thing I would like to start with about Nestorianism is that, actually, contrary to the name, Nestorianism actually even goes back the idea of Nestorianism. Now, if we even want to go way back, we can even say that adoptionism is a form of Nestorian theology. But even before that, we can signify two names, Diodor of Tarsus and Theodore of Mopsuestia, who both argued that there is really two persons. There is a human Jesus and there is a divine Jesus. And Theodore of Mopsuestia was condemned in the Fifth Council. So, again, with Nestorianism, the brief idea of Nestorius was that there is a union of persons. So there is a prosopic union, and because there's a union of persons, he tried to argue that there's only one person at the end of the union, and he argued for a composite personhood. But one of the arguments contrary to that, and one of the arguments that illustrates that this doesn't really follow, is that in his concept of union of personhood, first of all, it's a union based on will instead of based on nature, and because of that, and because the persons are still nevertheless distinct after the union, it still leads to two persons because they're distinct. So it's kind of saying like, oh, there's one and two persons, which isn't logically consistent. And one other philosophical problem that Nestorianism dealt with is that there is no hypostasis without nature for them. So if there is a nature, there has to be a hypostasis. Christ has two natures, meaning Christ has two substances, right? Humanity and divinity. And because of that, there needs to be two persons. So that's one of the other logical conclusions that Nestorians arrived to. And all of this was rejected in the Third Ecumenical Council, the Council of Ephesus. And many things happened afterwards. There was a schism between Antioch and Alexandria after the Council of Ephesus, and this lasted for 2 years. And there was a reconciliation between Saint Cyril of Alexandria, the Alexandrian Patriarch, who was also the president of the Ephesian Synod, right? So he's a very important person in this controversy, and between the Antiochian Patriarch John of Antioch, where Antioch basically said no to Nestorius. And this whole problem really started not because of the theology itself, but because of the consequence of the theology, where Nestorius rejected that the Virgin Mary is the Mother of God. So he rejected the title Theotokos because of his understanding of the union. So for him, she gave birth to the human person Christ, and this could not be attributed to the divine person in his mind, to the divine nature in his mind. Therefore, saying that she gave birth to God for him was heretical. So this is really how it all kick-started in 429, and until 431, where the first Council of Ephesus happened, Nestorius got anathematized. But so this is basically Nestorius's basic theological presuppositions and why they're wrong and how he came to those conclusions.
Yeah, so let's quote real quick from the Council of Chalcedon. The distinction, it was ruled in the Council of Chalcedon, the distinction of natures being in no way annulled by the union, but rather the characteristics of each nature being preserved and coming together to form one person in subsistence, not is parted or separated into two persons. So that's kind of a summary of what David said. So, well, there. Okay, Snek, do you want to add anything, or should we move on to Eutyches?
No, we'll talk about this when we mention the councils, but basically, after the Synod of Ephesus, you have the Synod of Chalcedon, and then the fifth and the sixth Synod, which are all the continuation of the same theology, of the Cyrillian theology. But we're going to cover this when we'll talk about council specifically.
So we have another Christological heresy that comes up from a man named Eutyches, which became known as Eutychianism. And that basically is the idea that the human nature of Christ was absorbed by the Logos. And Christ only had, therefore, one nature. And again, this is going to be responded to in Chalcedon. So I kind of give the overview and the purview of what that heresy is, and then feel free to pick up on that, guys.
In regards to Eutychianism, that is also another heresy that it's kind of like Nestorius, but the timeline is not, the time difference is not that huge, where it used to be referred to as Synusiusism. So Eutyches, what he did is he misunderstood a Cyrillian quotation, which is the one incarnate nature of God, the Word. He misunderstood that to mean that there's one essence after the union. And so he argued that that Christ was not consubstantial with us in his humanity. He was really that was mixed, right? So you have some people that say there was a mixed essence, a mixed Christic essence. That doesn't follow, because you can't be 50% consubstantial and 50% not consubstantial. It doesn't really work that way, and a substance has to be 100% identical to something else. So there is no like mixed Christic nature. That doesn't logically follow, and so it stems from a misunderstanding of a Cyrillian argument, and this was fleshed out in the Council of Chalcedon, where it argued for a distinction between the two natures of Christ, which is the humanity and the divinity. And that's the main thing that Chalcedon tried to argue against, is that Christ really did possess two natures, and nature is synonymous with substance, so we can say that as well. So he possessed two substances, humanity and divinity, after the union, which is a strict rejection of the Eutychian heresy.
Good. Okay. Next, let's talk about monophysitism, from the two words physis and mono, which basically was the heresy that Christ only had one nature.
So in that regard, with monophysitism, what's also important to add is that for a long time it was used as an umbrella term. So it covered the Eutychian heresy as well, and it covered the Severan heresy. So if you're talking about, for example, the Oriental Church, they were referred to as the Anti-Chalcedonian Church, the Jacobite Church, but today they're referred to as the Oriental Orthodox Church, commonly known. So these people include Copts, right? The Coptic Church, the Armenian Church, the Ethiopian Church, the Syriac Church, and like Eutychius, there's a strict belief in Saint Cyril's one incarnate nature of God, the word formula. So this kind of, I'm not going to go too much into detail for this talk, but essentially there's in Saint Cyril's understanding, for example, for him, nature meant hypostasis, which meant person. Not all the time, but it meant person for that context. So that's why there's one nature. And so as far as the anti-Chalcedonians were concerned at the time, for example, when they saw that Chalcedon argued that Christ has two natures, for them they understood it to mean primarily that nature meant person, therefore there are two persons of Christ. So they saw it as a revival of Nestorianism. Again, I'm not going to go too much into detail about, which side is 100% correct and which side is wrong, but as far as Chalcedon was concerned, that wasn't the intention. The intention was not to revive any sort of Nestorianism. So the main point of divergence starts from there. And it also kind of changes the understanding of nature to hypostasis and codifies that, which we will be talking about later as the Monotheism heresies. But because of that understanding of what nature is, which is purely hypostasis instead of ousia, it will also end up having other positions later on by their fathers. But again, this is, for a basic overview, it's basically a rejection of Christ possessing two natures after the union. That's what monophysitism consistently is. It's a rejection of two natures after the union. That's basically should be enough for this talk. I've done some talks. I've done video series about this that goes into detail. So
further depth, exactly. And then that leads us into one will, monothelitism. So that's the idea that Christ didn't have a human will, but only a divine will. And obviously they're going to try to take passages from Scripture that basically will make it seem as if Christ has no human will, since it's completely obedient to the Father's will, so only divine will. And this is rejected at Constantinople III in 680 AD. So
and
we could talk more, and that's really kind of more of a problem, I think.
And in regards to monothelitism, Oh, can I go on, or did you finish?
Yeah, please. All
right.
That's what I want you to do.
All right. In regards to monothelitism, well, there's two things to mention before I go on. But the main argument about monothelitism was that Christ possessed one will. A lot of the proponents argue that it was one divine will, purely divine will, but it was also, it was only purely divine will. So I'm not going to go too much into detail about this, but this problem was initially, the purpose was to kind of reconcile with the anti-Chalcedonian position, because many of their theologians also believed in monothelitism. Themisius comes to mind, who's an anti-Chalcedonian, but also Severus of Antioch, Philoxenus of Malbach, these big Oriental saints who believed in one will. And John of Ephesus, who is also an anti-Chalcedonian saint, also records this, that the proponents of monothelitism were Severus, Philoxenus, and many of the other Oriental fathers. So this was initially kind of like an attempt to reconcile with the anti-Chalcedonian party, but it ended up becoming a full-fledged heresy. The main error of monothelitism was that it understood will to be property of person, but there's a logical error in that if you want to have a consistent triadology, because if you apply that to the Trinity, then the Trinity has three wills because there are three persons. And because there are three persons, there has to be three wills. This leads to tritheism, right? Which was also condemned in the same Ecumenical Council. And the point I made previously about Monophysites is that they subverted the understanding of nature to mean hypostasis. So for their system, nature, it's still a property of nature in their system. It's just that nature means person in their system. So the same critique applies to their position. So in a lot of ways, monothelitism is pretty similar with anti-Chalcedonian understanding of wills. But I will add this kind of like an additional note. I think with the readings I made about the anti-Chalcedonian fathers is that their position on monothelism is actually, I think it's a lot more nuanced. It's a lot more advanced, I will say. It's much more better than the monothelitism that we dealt with in the 7th century, but it's still nevertheless the same system. It's more nuanced, but it's still the same error in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. Good. We'll deal with the heresy of iconoclasm as we talk about Nicaea 2. But let's just do a brief overview of now we can say there's more than 7 ecumenical councils, but when we say the 7, we all know what we're talking about, right? So we've got Nicaea 325 AD, Constantinople 1 381, Council of Ephesus 431, Chalcedon 451, Constantinople 2 553, Constantinople 3 would be 680 to what? 681, yeah. And then finally 7, Council of Nicaea 2, both 787 and 843.
Yeah. So this would be a great time to explain our differences with branches of Christianity or heresies that still exist today. So the Council of Ephesus that deals with Nestorianism is a moment where the Orthodox Church gets separated with the Nestorians, so that would be the Assyrian Church of the East, for example. Chalcedon is a council where there's a separation between the Coptic communion and us, which includes the Armenian Church, the Syriac Church, the Coptic Ethiopian Church, and the Ethiopian Church. And even though there is no iconoclast apostolic church or monothelite apostolic church, we can see many of these heresies being revived through Protestantism, because sola fide and everybody can interpret the Bible as if see fit, makes these heresies reappear. So this did not cause schism formally with churches that still exist today, but some churches that came to exist later picked up on some of them. For example, Nestorianism is pretty much the norm in some Protestant churches.
Yes.
When they deny the Theotokos, the Mother of God. Iconoclasm is pretty in vogue since Calvin among the Reformed and the Protestants. So the idea of breaking all the images, denying the incarnation this way, breaking all the images, calling everything that's not just a plain cross, idols.
You also have Nestorianism within Calvinism as well, of God punishing, the punishment that was due to this kind of infinite offense of human beings being then taken out on the Son, being then taken out on the Son, and a kind of hatred is another version of Nestorianism. And then you also see this in Protestantism, that their interpretation of my God, why have thou forsaken me, that they actually will split the divinity, the divine nature from the human nature in their interpretation of what happens to Christ on the cross. So another version of Nestorianism resurfacing.
Yeah. So that would be the 7 Ecumenical Councils. Should we cover the 8th Ecumenical Council?
Let me just give, so I gave the dates. Let me just tell you how many were in attendance. In Nicaea, 325 AD, we have 318 in attendance. And this is called by the Emperor Constantine the Great. And remember, the emperor does not participate theologically in a council, but has the right and often duty to actually call the council to keep the peace of the empire. So we'd already brought that up in part 1 to dispel the myths of zeitgeist and Bart Ehrmanites and all these other crazy loons that come up with Constantine created all this theology. No, Constantine wasn't allowed, and we give further kind of more detailed arguments. Constantinople I, approximately 150, so smaller. We have Emperor Theodosius, Pope Damasius, and by the way, so let's just name some notable figures in Nicaea. You have of Alexander of Alexander, the basically the Archbishop.
Yeah.
Saint Athanasius. Yeah, Saint Nicholas, Saint Spiridon. Some famous. You guys think of any more famous?
Saint Spiridon.
Yeah, I mentioned Saint Spiridon. Constantinople I, the Cappadocian Fathers, Saint Gregory of Nyssa, Saint Vasile or Basil the Great, Saint Gregory the Theologian, the 3 hierarchs. Okay, Ephesus, about 200 or more actually in attendance, with your man Saint Cyril of Alexandria is a notable figure there. Chalcedon, 350 plus. Notice that the numbers here are getting bigger, but there's some speculation can be even as large as 500 or 600 in Chalcedon. Convened by Emperor Marcion and another notable figure, Pope Leo the Great. Constantinople II, roughly about 160 in attendance. Constantinople III, roughly 170. And Nicaea II, 300 plus. Convened by Empress Irene and Empress Theodora in 843, Empress Irene in 787. So those are just some kind of significant numbers. So, okay, let's go in. Where should we pick up? Constantinople I, where do you guys want to pick up? So we covered, let's see, or should we? You guys pick up where you want to go on the councils, just to talk briefly.
We can. I think we talked about the councils, all of them. I think we can talk about like the 8th and 9th ecumenical councils, which is kind of like not well known. There's if you want to do that.
Yeah, let's just say the 7th ecumenical council in review is the heresy of iconoclasm. In which case, St. John of Damascus' works and writings become very important in defending the faith of Orthodoxy. it's argued that this heresy spread into the empire and even the emperors through Islamic iconoclasm, the influence of that. And so the icon bashers or hater, the iconoclasts is what the word means. And notice with all these is often the murderous persecution of the Orthodox faithful. And so this was resolved and is considered the triumph of Orthodoxy. The Sunday of Orthodoxy, which we celebrate, is kind of encapsulating the celebration of all the church is conquering all heresies. So we kind of use the Seventh Ecumenical Council as like, we always defeat every heresy. With patience, God will triumph and his enemies will be scattered. So yeah, iconography, which is not idolatry, which was the accusation, and the distinction between worship and veneration, and what iconography is as far as referring to the prototype and the kind of ontology of what an iconography, what an icon is settled in the Council of Nicaea II. So that just kind of summarizes Nicaea II. So, okay, with that, go ahead, guys.
Yeah, I kind of remembered we kind of skipped past Constantinople II, the Fifth Ecumenical Council. With Constantinople II,
oh yeah, we did. Mm-hmm.
The main problems in that council, it dealt with the 3 chapters, which were Nestorian writings, that some claims were authoritative, that Chalcedon confirmed it. So the Fifth Ecumenical Council basically condemned the leftover Nestorian arguments, letters, and so on and so forth. It also, and I think this is kind of undervalued and not talked about much, but it also canonized Saint Cyril's one incarnate nature formula. So there's and I want to kind of talk about this because this is a mistake that people make a lot, is that people refer to, for example, the Coptic churches as Miaphysite, which, okay, yeah, I mean, they will say that they're Miaphysites, and sure, that will be true, but we are also Miaphysite because in the Fifth Council, Miaphysitism, the concept was already accepted, but the term was also dogmatized, canonized, and so in the Orthodox view, not only are we Miaphysites, but we're also Diophysites, right? So the more detail if you get into this in more detail, these two ideas don't actually run contrary to each other. So they're both complementary. And if you look at the writings of Saint Maximus the Confessor, Saint John of Damascus, a lot of them actually will say that those two formulas are necessary. So Saint Maximus the Confessor, who refuted monothelitism, who's like the key figure who refuted monothelitism, he wasn't alive at the council, at the Sixth Ecumenical Council, but his ideas were really, really relevant in the council. He, for example, says that both formulas are 100% necessary. So the Fifth Ecumenical Council is very important. That kind of qualifies Chalcedon and interprets it in an orthodox manner. So there are instances where we can say that a council can interpret another council if there's leftover heretical interpretations of that council. So that will, I guess, cover everything about the Fifth Ecumenical Council as well. And it's not really talked about that much. So yeah.
Good. Yeah, I'm glad we covered. And also condemning the various errors of origin within Constantinople too. We forgot to talk about that. I mean, we won't go into details on that, but just a side note.
Yeah, I would like to mention also regarding the councils that these councils also prove by precedence Orthodox ecclesiology, because we're going to see that after the Seventh Council, all of these we have in common with the Roman Catholic Church, and the schism happens after these councils, and these councils are actually great arguments for Orthodox ecclesiology being enforced. For example, the fact that the Second Council, Constantinople I, was held and presided by someone who was in schism from the Pope, Saint Meletius of Antioch. That neither Rome nor Alexandria were even invited to the council because of circumstances and because they were considered in schism with the president. of the council. I would like to mention that no patriarchate historically have been free from any heresy. All of them, to an extent, fell at some point. So we've covered, for example, Constantinople falling during the Nestorian crisis, but one of the biggest crises in the church in terms of affecting all patriarchates was also the Monotheism crisis. And actually the Sixth Council condemns many heretics, among which Honorius, who was a pope of Rome.
Mm-hmm.
So Honorius was actually judged by council, so that also sets a precedence for council being, superior to the pope, being able to judge, anathematize, and remove the popes from the communion of the church, even if it was post-mortem. So yes,
that's a great segue into the nature of ecclesiology and the structure of church governance. We like to use the words conciliar and synodal as far as the way so the church is hierarchical. It's not a free-for-all, but it's authoritative. It can be binding and normative at various levels and degrees. For example, the deacon has some authority, but the lowest sort of authority in the hierarchies. Your priest has an authority. But notice this isn't flushed out in terms of infallibility, but what is binding or normative. So if there's a problem with the priest, where do you go? To the next. In fact, this is established in the Byzantine model is actually precedent for the Western legal model too, of courts of appeals and hierarchical structures. Where do you think they got that from? So you go to the bishop but the bishop's ruling is more authoritative. It's not infallible, but it's more authoritative than the priest. Then you have the synod of bishops, and so on and so on. And you can have various levels of synodal councils having more authority. And what we would say, as far as the highest authority would be, and notice the synodal bishops, there's not absolute authority in any one. It's not that you even have to have a particular number or that all be represented, as you pointed out in the some of the historical examples of the Ecumenical Councils. But it's still representing a structure in which all the authority is not placed into one office. It's decentralized. It's still hierarchical, but it's what we call conciliar in synodal. If you guys want to talk about that.
I think we've covered it by explaining that, authority, like the highest form of authority we have are the councils. We've explained it by showing that it's what the church used biblically to solve problems with Acts 15. It is also a type of Pentecost, so all of the bishops or successors of the apostles being united in expressing the apostolic faith can seal this decision with the Holy Spirit, can inspire them to make this decision with the Holy Spirit, and that's what we call councils. But ultimately, that's the form the church always had. Many will think that the decentralized system is not efficient, but actually it is very efficient. Yeah. Because if you look at it, just from a historical standpoint, we can see that we are very close from the early church. And if you look at all the churches, the churches that adopted the conciliar method, because there is not a centralized head that can be corrupted, because everybody has a duty to keep what he has on their own. And whenever there's a problem, everybody comes back and compares. It allows to detect very quickly if an error is present. because everybody compares. I've heard some people comparing it to bitcoins. It's interesting. The idea is that everybody has a ledger being saved, and whenever there's a problem in the chain, people come back, compare, and restore the chain to its original state. So that's that would be an apt comparison, if a bit modern. But yes,
so that's a great point. Yeah, is that it's quite efficient on the idea of preserving and protecting the church from error. So errors, there's free will, and error is going to enter in. That's unpreventable, but you can't prevent that. But given your system and ecclesiological structure, there's ways of dealing with that in the most efficient way, which you pointed out. Because if you put all the power in one office, then what happens when corruption comes in? It basically, the whole house of cards and structure becomes corrupted, and it becomes impossible, if not, practically, even theoretically, to be able to get rid of the infection once it enters into the system. So that's the history you see in the church. Is the way the church governs is both in a conciliar and synodal manner. So that's great. Okay. Now, the reason why we're talking about that is because that sets up for a conversation about why and how the Great Schism in the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church happens, so that now you have what's referred to as the Roman Catholics versus the rest of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, which we now call Orthodox. So I'm just kind of laying out some various issues. There's going to be issues of certain developments pre-schism in the West with adoption of certain practices and the avoidance or inability to read the full course of materials of the church, namely what was available in the Greek if one was limited to Latin. And certain trends, not obviously just limited to the language, but certain trends to embrace certain kind of philosophical projects, and the problems that kind of lays out. And also we'll talk a little bit about with the fall of the Roman Empire in Rome, what happened with the church in the West is an attempt to compensate for that might have actually caused problems, such that all of these things coming together end up kind of giving us a historical picture of what leads up to what's called the schism between the East and West.
Yes, so it is hard to pinpoint a date to when the schism happened. It is hard to pinpoint a single cause. Usually people refer to 1054. That's a go-to date. Why? Because that's a moment where the Roman Patriarchates sends a letter of excommunication to the Patriarch of Constantinople, and basically they separate themselves from the rest of the church. But if we look at the reasons, there are already many. So we have one reason that is political, the idea, and ecclesiological, which will be the idea of Rome being superior to all other patriarchates in a way that it would allow them to be the only one to dispense dogma, to be the only judge of dogma, and to have supremacy over them. And then you will have different dogmas that have been used as well. So, namely the filioque. The idea is that the Holy Spirit proceeds not from the Father alone in an ontological sense, but from the Father and the Son in an ontological sense, which makes the Son a source of the divinity, which blurs the line between the Father and the Son. I'm not going to go into the theology of it, but it's rejected by Eastern fathers, clearly by some Western fathers as well. And even though it became popular in the West, you still had links between the East and the West being made and explaining the position. So, for example, Saint Maximus, the confessor, clarifies the differences and explains an Orthodox position on the Filioque. We have the Synod of Saint Photios as well that explained it, and saying that you cannot change a creed to add a Filioque. And we even have counter movements in Rome against the addition of the Filioque to the creed. Pope Leo III, for example, opposed the addition of the Filioque to the creed. So that would be one of the reasons that caused it. Another reason would be different uses and different traditions in the church. For example, mandatory clerical celibacy in the West, the use of unleavened bread in the West as opposed to leavened bread.
The introduction of
today's admit is more traditional, and then you have also a more political side of it, which is the appearance in the West of a Frankish church that worked alongside and in parallel with the other churches to some extent, and which tried to monopolize the title of emperor and use the Patriarchate of Rome to this end. And it started with the donation of Pepin. So Pepin is from the Carolingian dynasty, the same dynasty as Charlemagne, and Pepin actually conquers some parts of Italy and gives it to the Pope. So at this point, you have the Pope being also a king or prince, and basically this is putting him directly into the political.
That is the donation to Pepin. Well, the Pope is given.
So that's pushing him directly into the political scene of the West. The West that has been whittled down. The West was the Roman Empire, didn't exist anymore. When you have barbarian kingdoms converting to Christianity, solidifying themselves, and that just propels the Pope to a political role that isn't traditionally befitting of hierarchs, even patriarchs, because he becomes a prince and he becomes kingmaker, and he actually crowns Charlemagne. Charlemagne becomes a Western emperor. And
while we already have that's right. While we have an empress,
Irene, which we talk about
Irene in Constantinople at the time. So it's a rival political power.
And
it seemed to be problematic.
And the way the Frankish Church tried to solidify itself and Charlemagne tried to solidify itself was proclaiming a new dogma. So you have the Synod of Aachen, which was opposed by Pope Gregory III, Pope Leo III, sorry, as I mentioned. And this synod modifies a creed. And the Council of Ephesus, which we talked about, says you cannot modify the creed. So it modifies the creed, it adds a filioque, and this is the start of worsening relations, first between the church, the Frankish Church and the Church of Rome, and then between the Church of Rome itself, which was the first one to fall to filioquism, and the Eastern churches. And we see this in the Synod of Saint Photios, which I mentioned, which is the 8th Ecumenical Synod to us, which was accepted by Pope John VIII, and basically said that you cannot, basically reinstating Photios after some controversy, and explaining you cannot change a creed, you cannot add filioque to the creed, and Saint Photios was also a great fighter against this heresy of filioquism. So this is what set up the Schism of 1054. When the Schism of 1054 happened, the church were separated, but such schism already happened before. So I wouldn't have, we couldn't use this so much as a very hard date of the start of of separation, because you still have contact between one church or another. That's why we cannot use it strictly.
Right.
You have something to comment on this?
And then let's just say too, there were attempts to unify. There was even shall we say, false attempts, or attempts to make like false unions. And what we mean by that is kind of compromising on uncompromising issues. And one of these that we see is the Council of Florence as an attempt to, again, we all pray for unity, but on God's terms, not ours, and without compromising true doctrine and praxis. And we have to thank within the Council of Florence, in which many of the Eastern hierarchs were signing the false union, that one of the heroes that came out, that actually, I think he had a fairly open mind going into the possibility of union, but what was discussed in the Council of Florence led him to realize that these are incorrect doctrines and could not be compromised, since it would compromise the faith, and becomes another defender of orthodoxy, Saint Mark of Ephesus, who refused, even under extreme pressure, to actually sign that false union with.
Yeah.
And so that kind of becomes the last straw of any attempt to, as far as I know, historically, any significant historical events that.
Yeah, Florence tries to heal a schism that is already, well underway. We can see it also with what happened 200 years after the schism of 1054 and 200 years before Florence, which is also, which is not an ecclesiological event, but shocked the mind of the entire East, which was the sack of Constantinople by Crusaders.
Yes.
During the Fourth Crusade, so that's in 1204, and
so let's just talk real briefly about for those who don't know, what the Crusades were, because people get this confused.
Yeah. So after the schism, and actually before the schism, you had a big parts of the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire, falling to the Muslim expansion. Parts of this expansion took place in the Holy Land, and after the schism, one of the ways the Pope wanted to rekindle relations, so that's some decades after the schism, rekindle relations with this then dwindling Byzantine Empire, was to help the Byzantine Empire reconquer land. So he actually managed to call armies to holy war, to reconquer land, and their goal was to reconquer the Holy Land and Jerusalem. So you have a series of crusades. You have the establishment of Latin Crusader states, actually, instead of fully reinstating the Byzantine, the Orthodox cities. But the establishment of Latin Crusader states, and after the Latin Crusader states are crushed, the Pope wants to gain new footholds, and one of these crusades, the fourth one, is aiming for Egypt, and they got diverted. They get in debt because of the Venetians that were hired to ferry them. They get sidetracked, and ultimately they get involved into a succession crisis in Byzantium, which ends up in the sack and the destruction and the pillage of the city, which was at the time the greatest city, the greatest Christian city. some called it the center of the world, which it was filled with relics, golden icons that were melted down. A lot of the relics you find today in the East were stolen at this point, and it was a great shock for the East. It was a great shock for the Orthodox Church, and
yeah, you mean a lot of the relics you find in the West are actually stolen from the East.
Yeah,
that's what you meant to say.
And even though there were denounced by the Pope at some point when they started to attack Christian cities, because they attacked several Christian cities before attacking Constantinople. That's a moment where there's a change in mindset in the West, where we are not only departed brother, but we become legitimate targets. So after this, the Roman Empire is actually dismantled. You have several successor states. You have the establishment of the Latin Empire, which is a Latin version of the Kingdom of Thrace, of Constantinople, and you have the justification of the Novgorodian Crusades, which are crusades led by the Teutonic Knights against the Russian Orthodox people, and that's where you have the battle between Saint Alexander Nevsky and the Teutonic Knights. So these are not purely ecclesiological events, but these are a change in mindset, and this is really the consumption of schism, and that's why the Byzantine Empire and the Eastern Patriarchs were pushed for political reasons to union with Rome, because after the dismemberment of this empire,
right,
you have the Ottomans coming in, you have the Turks, Seljuk Turks gaining ground as well. Seljuks will become Ottomans later. But you have this idea of the need for compromise. And the need for compromise goes to the Council of Florence, that during the 1400s. And the Council of Florence is where the church makes this painful but necessary decision to say, even if the Roman Empire, which at the time people believed to be eternal and whose divine mission was to reconquer the old world, the extension of this empire, it was a decent sacrifice for the conservation of the true faith. So at the moment, even though we're being accused of Caesar rapism and of putting the political before everything else, that's the moment where we decided to put our faith first, and that then leads to the occupation of the Greek lands by the Ottomans, of the Balkans, Serbian lands, Romanian lands, so on, by the Ottomans. But conservation of faith is at the moment where we decided that all faith was stronger than the political. So that will be a brief summary of our early relations with the Church of Rome after the Schism.
Yeah, and then we'll just end with a brief discussion about the in the Protestant Reformation, that really this is kind of not directly related to the Orthodox, because it's this is already after the Schism, which and we could talk about two saints, both Martin Luther and the Roman Catholics' response in the Council of Trent, and they're kind of further dogmatizing certain things. But really, this is a Western issue and problem. And then also the Church of England. And then soon after Martin Luther, the Reformers, Calvin, Zwingli, and the rest, and kind of spreading throughout the Western world, in which the East really didn't have much contact with that. So we'll just end there. So if you guys want to say anything about that.
First, I would just add an Orthodox answer to some arguments. There's this idea that we didn't promote any other council. We didn't have any other binding universal councils after Schism. It's actually wrong. We have a council that is dedicated to answering Western scholasticism, which then led to many other stuff like Renaissance and
Enlightenment. Was that the Council of Bethlehem, and is it Bethlehem, Council of Jerusalem, and then Jassy too?
Yeah, and even before that, I would like that. Even before that, there's also the Palamite synods that is considered as ecumenically binding. And if you go to the liturgy, for example, second week of Lent, which is the week of Saint Gregory Palamas, the Hesychast synods are considered dogmatic and binding, just like an ecumenical council.
Yeah. So we have council reacting to this. We have councils that actually explains that we do not follow the scholastic medieval understanding. We follow the traditional understanding, which teaches essence energy. We have a council that also combats the Uniates, which are basically Roman Catholic Trojan horses that disguise as Orthodox, which are still a thing.
And there's a real bloody history about forcing Orthodox into Unitarism too that people often forget about.
Yeah, we have people covering this. I think Jedi has a stream about this specific topic with a former Uniate. But then comes the Reformation, because Rome changed after moving away from us, and this caused a lot of rebel in the West. And from this rebel was born some heresies of Protestantism. So Protestantism, sola fide, rejection of tradition, and even some movements that are considered pre-Protestantism, like the Hussites and things like this. Basically, the Orthodox understanding of this was first to contact them, because first they didn't deny fully tradition. So we actually they tried to contact us. Luther praises the Greeks at some point. They tried to contact us. We tried to find common ground, but basically they wouldn't move back to tradition, and they evolved in opposition to tradition, and they never denounced sola fide, sola scriptura, and all these other dogma. And that's why or dialogue with them never went through. That's why we have synod like the Synod of Jassy, Synod of Jerusalem, which combat these novel heresies of the Protestants. And to us, it's a missed opportunity, because in the beginning, the early reformers like Luther, Zwingli, Melanchthon, they didn't want to throw away all of the traditions. They just understood that there were some bad traditions, some traditions of men, some non-apostolic tradition in Rome. The same way, for example, the same way that St. Mark of Ephesus gave argument against the fire of purgatory. You have some concording arguments given by Luther, but our deep regret and sorrow regarding the Protestant is that instead of understanding that the schism caused all this, and instead of removing the tradition that the West developed on its own non-apostolically, they just went all in against tradition. So today, I think we're in a point where dialogue with the Reformed Baptists and so on is going to be quite difficult. The Calvinists is going to be quite difficult, where they adopted early heresies, despite councils, where we have Nestorianism being the most common view in the Protestant world, iconoclasm being the most common view inside the Protestant world. But among these Protestant rebels, there were churches that still tried to look at history, tried to look at apostolicity, and that comes to Church of England. I don't know if you want to have a word on this.
So yeah, what's interesting about the Church of England, at least as far as traditions, I'll speak because you have what's called a high and low church. Low Church, Church of England, Anglicanism in the United States, Episcopalianism, whatever country it's in. For example, Ireland would be called the Church of Ireland. That Low Church is basically no liturgy. It's very similar to kind of evangelical Protestantism. So what's interesting about the High Church is that they actually perform the liturgy of St. James, and at least kind of liturgically kind of keep some ancient tradition. The unfortunate part is that they also tend to be very prone to kind of liberal theological and social issues that are kind of, so that's kind of, I don't want to go too far into depth into that, but we do know that contemporary current numbers are decreasing within the Anglican Church. And so you have attempts to kind of keep conservatism by maintaining certain conservative bishops in Africa, in which case different dioceses throughout either the United States or other areas will then be under a bishop of their choosing, either a liberal or a conservative, but usually the largest conservative bishops are usually in Africa. So there's really kind of no union within. It's unfortunately kind of falling apart, but it presents a unique opportunity for Orthodox to share orthodoxy.
Yeah, more recently there were promising talks, with the Russian nobility being pushed west, with the Queen of England marrying into a Greek family.
Mm-hmm.
There were these opportunities, but right now it seems difficult because the Church of England evolved rapidly to allow things that we wouldn't allow ever, like female clergy, female bishops, and some stances on social issues that border body iconoclasm, let's say. So yes.
Well, great. So I think that sums up a very difficult topic. But that's, hopefully that's helpful that we can see going over just sticking with just kind of the history and historical facts of, we're able to see various things, the development of the structure of the church and liturgy. We're able to cite some early historical documents, as well as church documents like the Didache, Shepherd of Hermas, the Proto-Evangelism of James, things that are used even outside of what we'd call the canon of Scripture, that are still part of the tradition and give us historical kind of records of what the church did. We talked about the process of canonization, what heresies, how the church dealt with heresies, the various political problems that arise, how schism happened and happens, and how the church deals with that. So I think that was wonderful. It was a wonderful talk, and we were able to talk about all the main kind of ecumenical councils and even some further councils and synods that dealt with various issues in preserving the true apostolic deposit of faith. So any other words you guys want to close with, Snek, David?
Yeah, I would just like to say that everything we've covered it very fast. Every single council, every single point of theology, every single historical point is deserving of its own 2 hours plus video. But we've tried to be as synthetic while giving still something that is complete and holistic. And if there's any need for clarification on specific topics, we would be glad to do other videos. But yeah, I hope this is at least a good summary and introduction to church history and the Orthodox understanding of church history, dogma, hierarchy, ecclesiology, and theology.
Yeah, and I will also like to add.
David.
I will also like to add that many of the things that we talked about have already been covered in huge detail. A lot of them have been covered in my channel. So stuff that relates to anti-Chalcedonian Oriental Orthodoxy has been covered in my channel. Stuff that relates to the Ecumenical Council, the Photian Synod, has been covered in. I've covered it in my channel. A lot of these things have been covered. So anyone that's interested can go check them out as well. But this was a good summary.
I'll plug David's channel too, so all of you guys can access that material. Thank you, David.
Yeah. So, but nevertheless, this was still a good basic overview of issues, kind of like an understanding of church history, basic understanding of church history.
Good. Thank you, guys, and thank you again. We'd be happy to entertain any further questions. So leave your comments. Make sure to like, subscribe. I'm gonna provide David's YouTube channel. Make sure that you like and subscribe to David's channel, and has all the wonderful resources there. And we hope to be doing more streams on various topics in theology. So blessings, guys.
Blessings.